Hi there. I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. Professor Samuel Issacharoff of NYU Law School is with us. He is an expert on the law and the political process. His book, Democracy and the Law, is a classic in the field. Sam Issacharoff will tell us whether, after Trump leaves office on January 20, his presence will continue to haunt us and Trump-style authoritarianism will continue to overshadow our elections. We're pleased to welcome Sam Issacharoff back to the program. Hi, Sam. Thanks again for coming on. And you are an expert on law and democracy. And I wondered, first of all, you wrote a book on the subject. So I wondered, first of all, you could comment on the state of democracy in light of the 2020 elections and whether you see democracy as being endangered in the post-Trump era.
I think that this last election was the most significant stress test of our democracy that we've had in a very long time, perhaps a century or more. And we saw in the outgoing administration an attempt to weaponize many of the major defects of our democratic system. So far, it has held, and there has to be repair done after the fact, but we've never had such a concerted attack by the President of the United States on the institutions that make our democracy function. So it's a perilous time. But the main point right now, I think, for everyone involved is that we survived. We had a pandemic. We had more people vote than ever before. We had the highest percentages voting in more than a century. Our election officials, who are mostly volunteers, poorly trained, poorly equipped, poorly paid, did magnificently and held out against tremendous political pressure. So in that regard, the citizenry performed well, our creaky apparatus survived, but it was tough.
Do you see Trump's conduct in taking on the electoral system? And remember, he claimed it was rigged, fixed, fraudulent before the election was even held. Do you see that conduct as seditious, as undermining of democracy, or do you see that he's simply exercising his rights under the Constitution?
Well, sedition is a loaded legal term, as you know, but I wouldn't go quite that far. But I think it is a systematic attack on democratic institutions. There's no way around that. We have two grave vulnerabilities that he highlighted. One has to do with the way we actually manage the election and the election count. And that's done in this country. We don't have a professional election apparatus. We rely on Democrats and Republicans in equal numbers to sit on local boards and to actually mechanically handle the counting of the ballots. Trump tried to weaponize that. Trump tried to get Republican officials whose job is simply ministerial to just refuse to accept the count, refuse to accept the election results. We saw a dramatic moment in Wayne County, Michigan, where a couple of officials first rebelled against him, one finally flipped, and the count went forward as it was supposed to. The second is that Americans believe that we have the right to vote. You think, if you're talking to your family, I voted for Trump or I voted for Biden, you don't say, I voted for John Smith, who's a fine elector, who will go to the Electoral College and exercise his judgment wonderfully. You have no idea who the electors are. Nobody does. But the formality of our constitutional structure is that the state legislature can determine the manner in which the electors are selected. In our early history, most of that was done by appointment by the state legislature. But for the last 200 years, we've lived in a democratic era. President Trump tried to weaponize that also by trying to get, and he's still trying, state legislatures to rebel against the vote of the people. And that is to take away the ballot from the mass of the citizens of their states. And he's had some success in getting individual legislators to do that. Fortunately for our country, even the Republican legislators, even the ones committed to him, even the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia, even the Republican governor of Georgia who defeated Stacey Abrams, even they said, wait, this is too much. You're now undermining the fundamentals of our electoral system.
Well, what's wrong with that in that in some states, it's simply by custom that the electors are selected by the majority of the popular vote. In other states, there's a law, but the Constitution makes clear that the state legislators can decide the manner in which the electors are selected. So even if you have a state where by law, the electors are selected by the majority of the popular vote, aren't the legislators free to repeal that legislation and appoint a slate of electors?
Well, there's a lot going on in that question, Jim. And yes, technically ahead of time, what we in the law call ex ante, the legislatures could say we are repealing the popular vote in Pennsylvania or Michigan or any state, and we're going to appoint the electors, and you, the people, no longer have the right to vote for president. I think any legislature that did that in our modern era could count the number of days that they would stay in office. They would be gone in no time at all, because it sounds so anti-democratic in a sort of the simplest way. You mean I can't vote for president? You're going to tell me who my candidate for president should be? And the question that you asked is effectively, can they do that after the vote? Can they do that when the it comes in and then say, nah, we didn't like this result, we prefer a different one, so we're going to do it? And the answer is, it's unknown. It's not specified in any cases. It's not come to the Supreme Court directly, and that power is difficult. On the other hand, Congress has spoken on this, and after the most recent really super contested election, the 1876 election between Hayes and Tilden, after that, Congress a decade later passed something called the Electoral Count Act. And the Electoral Count Act has a concept of a failed election. In the case of a failed election, it allows the legislature to come in. And by failed election, it's pretty clear they mean elections held during times of war, elections held during a natural catastrophe, an earthquake, a flood, something of a hurricane. And perhaps the legislature could step in then. But this concept of a failed election is a loaded gun aimed at the heart of democracy. And what President Trump was technically trying to do was to get the state legislature of Pennsylvania to declare the Pennsylvania presidential election a failed election. He was trying to get the governor of Georgia to declare, or the legislature there to declare the Georgia election a failed election. Not down ballot, by the way, where all the Republicans won, but only at the presidential level. And somehow there was fraud that managed to pump up Biden's vote, but didn't carry through the Democratic slate entirely, and the Republicans won pretty handily at everything else. So this is a weakness, and it needs to be addressed. And we've sort of known that this was a weakness and sort of danced around it. So it came up in Florida in 2000 with the Bush v. Gore scenario. And the Supreme Court more or less ducked it. They said, this is a real problem, but we don't have to address this because there's a different way in which the manipulations in Florida might violate federal law. It came up twice before in episodes that are largely forgotten. In 1960, Hawaii certified an electoral slate that was for Richard Nixon. Then there were some additional votes came in, and a second electoral slate was presented. And that had to be resolved in the Congress. And it had to be resolved in the first instance by the president of the Senate. And so Richard Nixon stood up in the Senate and said, the later slate for Jack Kennedy is the better slate, and I asked unanimous consent to accept it. It happened again with the Ford-Carter election, and Ford could have contested, and there it was much closer in the Electoral College. And he decided, I lost the popular vote. I can't possibly govern if I try to pull out an electoral college victory on a technicality. Trump is just a different order of person, of everything else. He lost by 7 million votes. The electoral college is not even close. There were close elections in some states, but he got routed. And he's just doing this, actually, if you want the motivation, he's doing this because he's raising hundreds of millions of dollars from followers. And this is just a grifter, cashing in on the way out the door, burning every building around him. It's horrendous.
Well, why do you suppose he has gotten so much support from leading Republicans in Congress who refuse to concede that Biden won the election?
In 2016, the Republican establishment tried to change the primary rules so as to ease the way for a mainstream Republican to win. And in that case, they were thinking it was going to be Jeb Bush. Donald Trump destroyed them. And it showed that the Republican Party has no core. Our political institutions in this country are weak, and our political parties are very weak. So anybody who stands up against Trump has no organized support behind him or her. Instead, what they have is a highly mobilized, tweeter-infused partisans of President Trump coming after them, including in primary elections the next time round. So there's no gain for them. There's no gain to standing up to Trump because they all know in their hearts that this is all over. They know what's going to happen. They understand perhaps the damage that's being done in the interim, but out of pure self-interest, they can't be part of the leadership against this unless 100 of them were to decide this at the same time, and there's nobody there to coordinate that.
Now, what about lawsuits? I mean, you mentioned the Supreme Court. Are any of Trump's lawsuits going to reach the Supreme Court? Will it be another Bush v. Gore where the judges potentially decide the election?
Bush v. Gore was a perfect storm. Everything turned on one state. It turned on 500 or 1,000 votes in that state, and it turned on a very discrete issue of changing the rules for what counts as a ballot after the fact. That raised a number of federal questions, and it got teed up for the Supreme Court. This time, I've been saying for months that this is not an election that's not going to end up in the Supreme Court. The lawsuits are there just to gin up publicity, either to put pressure on the state legislatures to abrogate the will of the voters or to raise money for the Trump enterprise. And the lawsuits, first of all, they're preposterous. They're so poorly done. There's just I hate to say this, but the craft side of me is just infuriated by the typos, by putting the wrong caption on the complaint, all this sort of stuff. But I think that something else has happened. If you read the opinions of the courts, and you see opinions by very conservative judges like William Pryor of the 11th Circuit, or Stephanos Bibas of the Third Circuit, who's a Trump appointee, what you see is, how dare you? How can you put in front of us a demand to overturn an election result and not have the decency to give a serious legal argument? This has been a problem throughout. It's not just mistaking the Four Seasons for the Four Seasons garden center. It's also, they do the same thing in all the legal pleadings. There's been only one serious legal issue in this case, which is, can the Pennsylvania Supreme Court change the date for when absentee ballots must be received after the fact, when the legislature has not done that? That's a serious issue. It's an unknown constitutional question, but nothing turned on it because the total number of votes was just a couple of thousand that were affected, and the margins in Pennsylvania were more than 30 times the size of the votes in question.
Now, Mitch McConnell has said repeatedly that Trump is entitled to bring lawsuits, and he's entitled to have the courts decide these issues. You mentioned the Third Circuit case decided by Judge Bibas. I think they're petitioning the Supreme Court for cert in that case. it only involves whether Trump is entitled to amend his complaint for the third time. And it doesn't really seem to be a Supreme Court type of case. But he is entitled to petition the Supreme Court. And as long as that's pending, McConnell says he's not going to comment on who won the election. So is this a holding action? And is bringing the lawsuits a good thing or a bad thing for democracy?
Well, bringing the lawsuits, I think, actually is irrelevant because there's something that I have always despised, which I call a press conference lawyer. That is a lawyer who files something inflammatory, holds a press conference, and then is not competent to pursue the case in any way. They hold a press conference, they say, there's massive fraud, it all has to be redone. And then you look at what they file in the courts, and it's something penny ante that has no bearing whatsoever.
Now, Sam, you are also an expert on authoritarianism. You were born in Argentina under the regime of Juan Perón, who was said to be authoritarian. Well, first, was Perón authoritarian?
Perón is complicated. I used to tell my American friends who couldn't understand Perón, I said, imagine if the United States were run by the Teamsters Union with Jimmy Hoffa at the head. That's the best image I can give of Peronism. It means you have good social welfare, but you also have corruption, you have thuggery, you have all sorts of nasty stuff that goes on. Peronism is complicated. I have compared Trump to Perón weekly, by the way. Perón was a much more capable figure, a much more transformative figure. But Trump has the same manner of what I call the caudillo, the strong man. He wants to be the one who decides. He doesn't need institutions. He doesn't need parties. He just needs to be the voice of the people. And that kind of strong man image, which we see in Hungary with Orban, which we see in India with Modi, which we see in Poland with Kaczynski, this is the impetus behind Donald Trump. He is not a political figure in the American tradition. I'll give you just one simple example. And you heard it in Biden's first address after the election. Every American president for probably at least a century begins every address, my fellow Americans. It's an affectation, but it shows I am one of you. I am the leader, but we are all in a collective enterprise. Donald Trump has never used that phrase. Donald Trump begins and ends everything with I.
Well, after Perón was ousted in, I think, a military coup, he came back to power in Argentina. Trump, a lot of people have said, Trump is going to run again in 2024. And polls show that he is double digits ahead of any other Republican notables, such as Nikki Haley or Mike Pence or Mitt Romney. So the question is, do you think Trump will seek to come back the way Perón did? And do you think that he'll be successful?
Perón was ousted by the military and fled the country. So he never lost anything. He never lost an election. He was never repudiated. And the stench of being a loser never attached to him. And that way, by being out of the country, he could be this empty vessel that everybody could put their hopes and aspiration into. And so Peronism, which is divided in many factions, has been the dominant political force in Argentina ever since. Trump lost. He can claim that it was fraud. He can rile up the 20-30% who are diehard loyalists, but he doesn't have the aura of inevitability. He's not the talk show host that has never been proven wrong. He lost. How it will play out over 4 years, this is a very fractious moment in our politics, and it's very hard to project forward. Yes, of course, today he's President Trump. He just ran an election. He got 70 million votes. That's unbelievable. Of course, he's going to be the most powerful figure in the Republican Party for a while. But then all the corruption cases are going to come to trial. There's going to be constant investigations, and there's going to be the ugliness of his acolytes, who happen to be all his family members, trying to seize control. And they are not as talented as he is. They are not as charismatic as he is. And slowly but surely, the cracks will open, and then somebody new will emerge. And we don't know who it is at this point. Every projection, Jim, I defy you to go back in time and tell me right after the election whether the conventional wisdom of who is going to be the next person has held up, and it never does.
Do you think that Trump will be indicted after he leaves office? And if so, by whom? And do you think he should be indicted?
I tell my students that any democracy that jails its former head of state is usually referred to as an ex-democracy.
Or a banana republic.
Or a banana republic. And I have given talks abroad in Poland and in Serbia and other countries that have had difficult regimes. And I encourage them, please don't turn to the criminal law if you take power back electorally, because at that point you create a martyr rather than an electoral transition in power. If Trump is indicted for past tax fraud or past nonsense foundations or Trump University by the DA in New York, that's fine. I don't care about that. He'll go to trial and maybe he'll be fined and probably he won't be sentenced because on top of everything else, he's quite senior. But if the Biden administration were to begin indicting Trump, it would be seen as an act of war by it would rally support around him. I think it'd be a terrible mistake. I thought at the time I was horrified, I was very young, but in retrospect, Gerald Ford pardoning Richard Nixon allowed the country to move on. When President Obama said, we are not going there, to demands from the left to prosecute the Bush administration officials for some pretty serious misconduct in the conduct of foreign affairs, that could not be the way to go forward. And instead, what happened is we had electoral repudiations of Bush in 2006, 2008, and the country moved on, and we had a successful 2 terms of President Obama. That's what has to happen now. We have to move forward.
Well, will Trump pardon himself? And does he have the power to pardon himself?
Nobody knows if he has the power.
It's never happened before.
Never happened before. We've never had this criminal an enterprise, this much self-dealing at the level of the presidency. It's horrendous. But I hope if he does pardon himself, good. Label everybody, himself and everybody around him, as a potential felon who needs a pardon. That's the way his administration should go out, in my view. So please do pardon yourself, pardon your whole family, pardon Rudy Giuliani, pardon them all, and get them out of the public domain.
Are there policy reasons, however, for the federal government to indict him, to uphold the rule of law? I mean, this isn't really criminalizing politics. I mean, if they're clear criminal violations, how can a Biden Justice Department ignore them?
There are some clear criminal violations by some subordinates, but as the impeachment hearing showed, remember the impeachment, Jim, by the way?
I certainly do.
Yeah, it came and went, right? And it turned out to be very difficult to impeach, partially for the obvious partisan reasons, but also because these crimes get blended into presidential authority in a way that makes the subjective state of mind, what's called the mens rea element of criminal conduct, very hard to establish. And much of what Trump did was, was self-dealing around the emoluments clause. But the emoluments clause in the Constitution, nobody knows what the word emoluments means. And it's never been operationalized in the 200 plus years of our Constitution. To all of a sudden raise that to a criminal offense, I think it's the wrong impulse. I think there should be investigations. I think there should be legal reforms about what a president may and may not do. And we have to realize that we we elected, I mean, the bottom line is we, the people, elected a charlatan as president of the United States. And we should consider ourselves extremely fortunate that we got out of these 4 years with as little damage as we did. And we got out largely because he turned out to be incompetent. Compare him to Orban in Hungary. COVID comes along and Orban uses that to seize power. He's on TV all the time. He says, if you criticize the government's handling of COVID, you go to jail. And so he used that to round up his opponents to cement his power. What did Trump do? He held a bunch of press conferences, promoted hydrochloroquine. Probably some friend of his runs the enterprise to do that, to produce that drug. And then he disappeared. What's he been doing for the last 2 months, for the time since the election?
Unfortunately, Sam, we've run out of time, but I have a question for you. Do you believe that democracy is in danger after Trump leaves office?
I think that democracy suffered a huge blow and public confidence in it was nearly destroyed. The fact that 150 million people voted, the fact that the election worked, is a sign of hope, but we really need to address these issues and not sit around waiting for another President Trump to come along.
We can't sit around waiting for another President Trump. Sam Issacharoff, thank you so much for coming by, and thank you for coming by. This has been just marvelous. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Meanwhile, take care, be safe, and all the best.